This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
I get emails from people who have found my name on our website as acquisitions editor, and they may not be all that reading oriented themselves, but goodness, the pandemic and God spoke to them, and they write very boldly. I think I have something to say, and here's why. So that's what that to me. When someone comes with no relational touch, no connection at all, not a much awareness of the broader conversations, either popular or academic, and just jumps in, it'd be akin to me trying to sell a technology idea to Apple. It's not going to go anywhere because you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the world. And whatever idea you have, it needs a heck of a lot more cultivation before you should be speaking. So that's the one end. And the other end are people are seasoned at this, and they've been at this a long time, and they have the networks. I'd say the mistake would be just to assume, and this is a common, I would say, evangelical type thing, just because you feel moved to write on something, that there's going to be some sort of providentially, this is all going to line up very quickly. God's providence works in mysterious ways, but it also works apparently organically and naturally, and through human contact, and also through the discipline of actually being able to shape ideas and grow and mature them to a point where they're actually worth sharing. So I'd say that the sort of instant author is it can sometimes be humorous, and sometimes you just need to have a gentle letter giving them some basic thoughts about it. So
I had not even thought about it makes complete sense now to me, because I have people who, like at my church or whatever, I want to write a book on this, that, or the other, and I'm thinking as somebody who's written a few books, like you have no idea of the process you're stepping into. And that interestingly, if I can relate this back to everything that I'm interested in, selfishly, I think correct me if I'm wrong, or you think it's something else going on, but what we're witnessing in those moments is kind of I have this thing inside me that I need to get out. It's like this inner-outer dichotomy, that the real, genuine stuff is on the inside and it needs to come out. And a book is the natural medium for this good stuff that God has put in me to come out, and then then I'll give you the stuff, and then you go sell that thing, right? Is there something like that going on?
I think there's some of that going on. I think on the evangelical side, there's this very immediate sense that God is speaking to me, and therefore, I need to share that, and some people have the wisdom to just share it with their small group, and that's okay. They can pray and help each other. Right. Others get a bit grandiose because they read a good book and they think, I could do something like this, and they're just not that they never ever could, but they're just not ready. They're far from ready. So the most comical side of that to me was I was crossing the border once, and from Canada back into the U.S., and the guard said, "What do you do?" And I told him, an acquisitions editor, and I told him what it's about. Oh, he says, I'm writing a book on all the stories from crossing, He says, can you give me your card? And I learned you never argue with someone who has, maybe college education, maybe high school education. They can also order cavity searches. So you'd be really nice to people. And so I stepped out of my car. I said, please, I'm just going to give you my business card. It's in the trunk. And literally he said, okay, sure. Then he calls out, hey, Frank, he's getting me his card. Don't drop him.
I didn't even think about it. You're kind of like a celebrity of sorts. Like everybody's got a book they're working on, right?
On the popular side, that's sometimes on the academic side, but more sometimes I'll run into a fresh PhD who thinks now I'm ready and everyone's going to jump on my. So that they're at least they've done some work and you can at least talk. But
Right.
yeah, not everyone literally has a book, but a lot of people think they have a book. They have an
Or
idea
they
of
have
a
an
book,
idea
right?
for a book, right?
And
Yeah. And they have no idea how difficult writing well is.
well, right,
I don't
exactly.
actually
But
write well, but yeah, I've heard that writing well is difficult.
yeah. So that's maybe the biggest. I don't know what the biggest mistake. Mistake is to not see that there is a process and a craft, and it's partly relational, but it's also partly the development of what you're doing. Uh, an occurrence is not a book, and there are authors, even our well-trained authors, who need to sort of slow that down, to slow their roll. I've come out of meetings with some authors at the SPL, and I won't mention names, but authors who publish frequently. And after one meeting, we have like 6 book ideas, on paper,
Mm,
uh, and if I don't pick them up, and in some cases I will, in some cases I won't, but I will see several of these pop up over in months. So
right.
even on the people who are well trained side, the idea of being slower and crafting, taking the time to do this, so there's something that an idea that you was a spark. But then the what's that phrase? Of course, 99% perspiration. It's definitely true.
Right.
Um,
Right. I wonder if have you had any stories of the opposite where somebody came in kind of unassuming and then you find out they're actually a brilliant writer and
oh,
have
that's
something to
interesting.
offer?
Sort of question. Uh, I don't I not quite that raw, but I have found people occasionally who are very, very tentative about what they're doing, and they show me something, and it's actually much, much better than they know. Uh, I have one
Hmm.
now. I won't mention her name either. It's in review. I just got the reader review back. This person, I've said to my colleagues, writes like Henry Nouwen in some ways.
Hmm.
Very, very humble about their work. No strong sense that they are doing anything significant. We'll see where it goes, but the potential is enormous. And yet
Hmm.
they weren't fully clued. I mean, they wanted to do this, and they've been working on this one book that we are going to do now, probably for 5 or 6 years. But kind of in obscurity, you know. In fact, I pushed this author to get some speaking engagements on their calendar with churches, just to share some of this, get some on the ground feedback, and
Hmm.
they hadn't done that yet, and that's been going well.
Hmm. Um, I think going back to the kind of the
Mhm.
process, I find that when I'm talking to new authors, and they say, "Hey, what do you do?" Like I say, "Well, you got to get a
Right,
proposal
right,
together," and they have these very standard parts of each publisher typically wants it formatted, but very standard parts. And the part that surprises them the most, which always surprises me, I was probably the same way. Is you have to do a little market research, basically see what books are out there and where your book would situate within
right,
those books. And I can't tell you how many times somebody has like, really, I have to think through that stuff. And I'm like, well, yeah, and it's good for you
right,
to think through
right.
those things, right? If somebody has already said this and better than you have, then obviously there's no point in you publishing
No,
this.
that's very
But
valid. No, I
Go
think
ahead.
that's very related to the thing that I come around to a lot with authors of all stripes, is to know their audience. Uh, they have an
Right.
idea, and this is not only younger authors, but typically younger authors, and they'll say, "Oh, it's for pastors, and it's for scholars, and it's for regular people," And they could be wrong on that, either because it's too simple or because it's too complicated. They don't know. They really don't know the audience. And the book
Yeah.
will go from like weaving, homespun stories with, 20 footnotes on the page, which just
Right.
completely blows both audiences out of the water. You're not writing for anyone
Mixed
at this point.
media, as it were.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that research also can help them shape this idea of who am I writing for. and not just the
Yeah.
idea, but who am I writing it for, and what difference do I want this book and this project to make for them? Is it just something to sharpen the guild, or is it something to help shape someone's life in some way?
Yeah, I think if you've done a PhD, that there's a very distorting
Right.
lens on this front, because I did a British PhD, which means I was essentially
Right.
writing for one person, the external examiner, um, and I remember actually I wrote my very first book with Cascade, which is part of Wipf and Stock, who you now work for. And I just remember getting about a third of the way through that process and stopping and thinking to myself, I don't know how to write a book. I wish there were a class on how to write a book. And you'll find this probably mildly humorous. Is the thought that horrified me was a PhD dissertation in no way qualified me to write a book. Like it's a completely different creature, and it took me a long time to fully appreciate how different a PhD dissertation
I think
is
that's
from a
very
book.
insightful that you were able to pick that up. There's people who never quite get there. What?
Well, I'm ashamed to say how long it took me to pick that up, but yeah, I did eventually
Well,
catch on. Yeah,
it's not that the PhD isn't a book of a kind. It's a book for a very small group of
right.
specialists, and that's fine to do. If you sell those, 100 to 300 copies to specialist libraries and specialist scholars, then you've accomplished what that book, can do. But the
Right.
PhD itself, what I find interesting is the authors who do this thing all the way to full tenure, right? And then suddenly now they want to turn back and write for the church. And that's all good, but what's happened is all the stuff that drove them through all that education may well have been, ministerial or wanting to help people with X or Y, but all their
Mm.
speaking, maybe not all their speaking if they're teaching, but all their writing certainly has been crafted towards a special form of discourse that is a scholar to scholar, peer to peer type of discourse
Yeah.
that needs, frankly, translation if it's going to, and reshaping even at a conceptual level. If it's going to get to that broader audience, it helps if you remain the teacher of let's say undergraduates. Then you can still imagine that audience. But the more remote you are even from that, for most people it's a relearning process. Right, like you did when you
Yeah.
were a student, maybe, but beginning student, maybe, but better, more.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, so I did not read through most of college. I didn't read at all. I'm a high school dropout. Didn't read at all up to that point. Had to read, and so I started reading in seminary, which of course it's like 14 books per class per semester, and so you're just drinking from a fire hydrant of nonfiction dense prose. And then, like, I think when I turned 40, I finally said, I need to read some fiction, and don't kill me. This is just the way it happened in my life, right? I wouldn't prescribe this for anybody. And then I told some friends of mine, I said, like, I really want to work on my writing. And a bunch of them had suggested for a year or two, hey, you should read really good fiction. It'll help your writing. And it kind of did. It wasn't as easy. It was easy for them because they'd been reading fiction, good novels their whole life. For me, it just, and of course, very quickly I stumbled upon Steinbeck's East of Eden, which was one of the best things I've ever read in my life, but it also made me think like, oh, well, I will never be a good writer. So like we're never getting there. So should I even write anything ever again? I wonder about the craft of writing. What kind of coaching do you have to do as an editor? Because you're an acquisitions editor, but you also help see people through the process of getting to the
Yeah,
book, right?
I'm acquisitions primarily, but with Select Project, I also do developmental editing, which means working with them on style and voice and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how others do it. I know a little bit from one or two of my former colleagues how they did it. I think I'm in that ballpark, but I just started to do this. I'd been at Erdman's, and it turned out it worked out well, and so I did more of it. So it's
Yeah.
two types of things: authors who don't really realize that they're pitching over people's heads. Trying
Right.
to get them to fill in, bring in more stories. Depending on the shape of the manuscript, my involvement can be light or it can be heavy when I do this. So in particular, when a manuscript is aiming to be for the broader audience, and they're just, it could get there. There are books that come, they want to do that, and I write them and say, no, this is not that book. You may want to do that book down the road,
Mm.
but this is because you're basically starting over if you want to do that. In cases when it's, okay,
Right.
it's within pitching distance, but there's some problems. I will annotate heavily as needed. And typically, it's like breaking up sentences, showing them how to use more real life examples on the front end of things to not assume terminology that is intramural, is going to travel all that
Right.
far. A lot of it, there are cases where I've done a complete rewrite of someone's chapter, sent it back to them, and said, "This is what it would take for your book to do what you want to do," or maybe it's 10 pages or whatever. I mean,
Almost
yeah,
like, are you
in
up for
some
this?
cases, and if I think it's too,
Yeah.
like if
Yeah.
I'm really, really skeptical, but they're really, really earnest, I might, I'll do like just 2 or 3 or 4 pages because it takes a long time, and just say, "This is what your book needs to look like. Do you still want to do that, or do you just want to admit you've written an academic book?" And if you want to write a book on this topic for down the road for a broader church audience or a broader audience of this or that kind, we can talk about that, and you can build on this other heavy work you've done over here. But to make it this is that, this is, you're basically starting over. But in many cases, it's not that bad. It is frequently. Too many people write like the Apostle Paul. They think a sentence is a paragraph and a paragraph is a sentence, uh,
Right.
and they love to start with the abstract versus the concrete, and it needs to go the other
Yes.
way if you want a broader audience. And not that everything has to be warm and fuzzy, but everything has to feel like it has a real life meaning for people to take you to journey with you in territory that's not immediate.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that word journey is the one that I've come to associate with writing more and more, is that you're getting over the shoulder of somebody and you're walking them down a road and you're, pointing things out. I think even in academic prose, you're often doing something like that in a written form. So it is very difficult to, like, I mean, we're talking about this casually as if all of this is obvious. But I think many of these things, I hear what you're saying, but I also know it took me 10 years to really hear what you're saying, right? And to the point where it gets into
Right.
my own writing.
Right.
So, and we should also point out that if somebody's coming to a publisher like you with a book idea, is typically, if they're a first author, is probably not going to be enough. You're going to need to see the manuscript, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right.
by that time they put in a lot of work, and you're already thinking like,
Mm.
okay, how much reworking are we going to have to do? So really getting kind of editorial advice, however you can, along the way, is probably the best thing
I
for new
agree,
authors.
and it
Is
can
that
be in
right?
different ways. There are writing groups and things like that can help
Right.
people along the way. Calvin College hosts a festival of faith and writing every couple of years, I think it is, and
Mm.
writers of all sorts, but mostly broadly from Christian fiction to spirituality, but in that end of the pool are there. And for acquisitions editors, it's kind of an interesting minefield because everyone wants to speak to you suddenly, and you're after the 10 or 15 top people on
Right.
your list that are going to be there. So you're trying to navigate someone just being being courteous or helpful to someone who's starting out where you can, and still try to go after people you think would be a good fit. But those are good types of events, and there are other ones to start networking with people, even fellow authors, discovering where to share material. I think it doesn't hurt to try to start maybe these days with a blog. hone your craft, get some feedback, ask people to, you're going to get feedback you don't want in cyberspace, and some of it won't be very nice, but along the way, you'll just the way the world is. But you can get some helpful things along the way. I agree with you. If someone is coming to me at any stage, an established author or not, if what can see something at the stage where they've written maybe just one or two chapters versus the whole thing, it helps if there's course corrections not to have to start over. So you can have an idea in a rough shape and unpack it, and then craft your best chapter, and then have others read it and give you feedback and go back to it. And I don't mind. I try to keep a little bit of time in my schedule for people. Often authors I know will send me someone more junior who needs a little input, and I'll take a few hours and read a chapter or two and make some comments and send it back to them. I think it's whether or not it comes back to us, it's sort of giving back to, and in some cases, some of these people will percolate upwards. Like this one author I mentioned earlier that I described as like now and started off kind of that way. I mean, they had a PhD, but they were trying to write spirituality and deep and meaningful and well sourced and well resourced and yet very readable. And so they were crafting it. Mm-hmm. So I was really pleased to see stuff early and give feedback. And in the end, finding a real proper reader, who kind of a master in the field, who was willing to spend some time in it, which was very, very helpful for the author.
And I think what people should be able to hear now is that although we, of course, the American ideal is the author in the room with the typewriter hammering away his, typically in that picture, his ideas coming out on the page. Or J.K. Rowling or something that's sitting in a coffee shop. And the truth is, it's a community enterprise, right? It's it will be one way or the other, right? So if it's not good writing, the community is going to have to come down on the later end. But the goal is to have the community involved the whole time, having people sharpen you and push back. And I can't live without editorial minds around me, and nobody would want to read anything I wrote without them.
I think that's true for it's quite possible that someone is born a natural genius and they sit down with their typewriter and maybe it is Rowling, that boom, there it is. Wow, can't believe it. I don't run into many like I do run into a few people where there's a spark here that really is worth fanning. For everyone that I get very excited about early in their career, I'm meeting a lot. Not that they're terrible, but you can tell that just like the rest of us, they're going to have to work at this. And that's not putting them down. They're just human. Some people have a natural spark for writing. It's even those need the kind of feedback. There's one guy who's a good friend of mine. His first draft was just like trying so hard to be poetic or something. I gave him some pushback. Some of his other friends did. His final draft of his published book was so much better. And he definitely had a bit of a gift, but he also sort of smelt his own air too much. It was just too much into being something, way too flowery where it didn't need to be, too many metaphors. Just need less of everything. Don't give us everything in every paragraph, okay? Because, but he was teachable, which was great. I don't know that he's a big selling author, but he's written a couple of books that are responsible and sound and well thought out and well expressed. He had the beginnings of it, but I just think that's true for most. There's not many who come fully formed at this.
Yeah, and so you should expect to rewrite and rewrite. I think. If I'm being completely honest, when I submit a manuscript or even with the trade book I've done, practice chapters, I cannot help but I almost feel like a little child at that point, kind of looking at the editor going, but do you like it? And I think editors are trained to look beyond whether they like, maybe you're just so used to dealing with so much content. There's kind of like this, who cares if I like it? We got to do this, and to make it work. And as the author, all you want to know is is it good? Right.
And it helps them authors to have some receptivity to that back and forth. There are also editors that are too heavy-handed. I've worked with a couple who need to be told by an
Yeah.
author, I can't, this is not your book, this is my book, So there is a balance.
Yeah.
What I used to say to the managing editor at Erdman's that I knew quite well is it's really the right synergy that you need to set up. Some people need that heavier hand.
Mhm.
Some people need someone to rewrite their material. Others, it's an absolute affront. And one of the best editors Erdman's had, I just won't throw names around, but retired a few years ago. He was amazing. He was an amazing writer in his own right. Amazing. He could take a very badly written manuscript. It could be shorter. It would be tighter in every way. And authors who needed that had the best friend in him. Other authors would be like, this is not my book. Get out of here. And they were just a bad fit. Such an author, depending, they were probably quite competent. They just needed someone to give them as much room as possible and really zoom in on those areas that needed more of. They were more critical. And with academic publishing, you can have a range of how scintillating it winds up being. So it is a question of, it's not like the editors are these great saviors in these situations. Their gifts have to dovetail well with the gifts of the author, and it is partly personality, but it's also partly whether these skill sets line up well or supplement each other well.
So I think, if you think about from beginning to end, once you've finished a manuscript on a book, you feel like you've completed something. But once you go to the publisher, to some people's surprise, you've just started something, right? It's like you've opened a can of worms, and you've started a very long process, right? So I don't know how long it is with you all currently, but if you bring in a manuscript that they like and just need standard work on it, it's a year and a half is not a wildly long time for that to see the light of day on paper.
We often do a little under that, but it depends on the project and what it needs. So I would say anywhere for an average sized book of 200 pages, let's just throw that number out there, anywhere from 9 to 10 months to a year and a half, depending on what's at stake in it and how much back and forth will be needed. Larger books, usually a little longer yet. Major reference books take multiple years, but yeah, it is a process. There will be a wait time. What the part that's most frustrating for the author is they submit the manuscript and publishers do their best to line up space for that project with someone's due date, but it never is perfect. And so sometimes they just wait a few weeks. Sometimes it could be a couple of months. And that waiting period before their editor actually dives in, that's when I'm, as acquisitions editor, someone will write me and say, I submitted my manuscript 6 weeks ago. I haven't heard from anyone yet, or from my editor yet. They've heard from someone, but I'll just reassure them. I'll check on the status. Yeah, it looks like it's coming up in their queue in the next 2 or 3 weeks. You should be hearing very soon. So that's.
It's hard, but you basically just need, especially with the first book, you just need to go do something else. And actually, I found that turning my attention to something else gets my mind completely. I got to kind of pry my mind from that book that I just submitted, so that when it comes back from the editor, I can see it with fresh eyes and maybe see it from the perspective they see it rather than from the inside. Okay, so a few dirty secrets about a published book, or I should say the ones that maybe I was most surprised to find out as a young author. That for most people, you don't get to decide the title of the book. Do you want to describe why authors don't get to decide the title? They don't have final say, I should say, on the title.
Final
for most
say.
authors.
It's a marketing thing. Publishers spend, thousands of dollars in salaries around people who are researching to the best of their ability what's working out there, whether they can line up a book with an audience and that sort of thing. Titles can be key in that process. Author, when it comes to how effectively titled something is, it really, again, depends on the skill of the author. We definitely have someone who starts off with, perspectives on the something world church of something, okay, this is yawn. even when someone brings me their collected essays, sometimes it gets by me by someone else's decision to do this, but I always say, don't put collected essays. Don't say essays on. Put that in the copy. That's
Right.
fine. We'll hide it.
Right.
But
Right.
so we definitely have a sense that some authors are good at this and some aren't. Likewise with maybe this is your next question, but likewise with covers, someone will say,
Yeah, that was going to be my next cover. Yeah, is like authors typically don't. They can state preferences, but they have no say in the final
depending on
cover.
how senior they are to some degree, and whether or not
Right.
they've
Right.
proven
Right.
in the past that they're impossible to work with on covers. And it really varies a lot. I mean, I know.
Well, and some publishing houses, like very high academic ones, they seem to not care whatsoever what goes on the cover, right? So, yeah, I've had that experience too, where they're like, "Oh, you want to put that picture on there? Yeah, fine, whatever. Who
Well, we
cares?" Right?
try to be
Yeah.
accommodating to the degree that's possible. One of my favorite old seminary professors, we did a book of his at Erdman's. I brought it in. I was happy. He sent me this picture of clip art of ballroom dancers that was supposed to represent God and the church. And it just looked,
Hmm.
it would have looked atrocious. It would have looked really cheesy. And he was very disappointed when I told him this would not happen. And in the end, I think he was pleased with the cover, which was more restrained and fitting for the book in this particular case. So you get these sorts of things where uh, authors have good instincts or they don't, and publishers, you hope, have gathered some collective wisdom. Doesn't mean they're always right, and sometimes I do think
Yeah.
we should listen to our authors if they have an objection carefully. I know
Yeah.
I've been in situations where an author was kind of forced a cover they hated, and it kind of ruined their relationship to the book. And then
Right.
they lost the heart to be as proactive for the book. You don't want to do that. If you have to override their first choices, you should be relationally involved with this person enough to hear them, to try to make them think what you're trying to do. In most cases, you can do that. Of course, there's odd personalities that are just hard to work with, but in most cases, with a little
Right.
patience and a few more email exchanges than you might wish you had time for in a day, you can work through these issues. And most publishers, most of the time, will do that. And there are exceptions.
Yeah.
I've heard horror
No,
stories too,
I think
and I've
they're
seen one or two, but yeah.
yeah, they're typically amenable to reason, but at the end of the day, it's their investment in the book that they're trying to make sure that they can at least recoup. So I think I've just met people who said, well, the title's going to be, at
Right.
the very start of their project, the title's going to be, and I'm like, I wouldn't get hooked on that title, right?
It may be.
Like, yeah, like maybe that'll be the title, but I've actually I go into every book with like, you go ahead and give it a title. I'm horrible at this. Every title I come up with sounds silly. So, um, one other, and we'll keep it to the last here. One other, I think, dirty little secret is that I think I've had people say to me, like, oh, well, you don't need your professor salary. You're making money off of all those books, right?
Right.
To which I laugh heartily. I think there is this kind of perception that because you have a published book, even with a great publisher, that you're somehow making a lot of money off these things. Do you have any sense of like? I mean, I know what I've made off of some of my books, but I always say, like, usually my annual royalties, I could go buy a really good dinner in New York City. That's about where I'm sitting with a book.
Yeah. It's
Uh,
so all over the map, So like three or four,
yeah,
half a dozen, whatever, major big names in religious and theological publishing. I wouldn't, you know who I mean. I mean, people like whether you're Bart Ehrman or Tom
yeah,
Wright. You're getting
yeah, exactly.
real money for this, and if you did nothing but write your books, you would be doing fine. Um, that is hugely the exception, but a much larger number who are making modest amounts, and so this has to be a labor of love for you, unless you get lucky enough to break through some sort of ceiling where suddenly people are calling you to talk, whether it's Fox News or NPR, on a regular basis. Once you get discovered culturally, you might break through to a point where, for a period of time, you may sell a lot of copies. That doesn't happen a lot. And people I've worked with, I can think of 1 or 2 cases where people have made some reasonably good money, where at least for part of their life, that was part of their real income, not just the dinner in New York. But yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and so you do this because you have something to share. It's a passion. It's in your bones. What I tell people when I'm negotiating over contracts, I know I'm never tough on certain things. Like, I'm not going to be like super hard nosed about a due date. If you can't make it, let me know. We'll adjust, because I know I'm not paying anyone by the hour here. And I don't want to antagonize people who are trying to balance real life, kids, work, pandemics, and this project, which we think is significant, and we'd like to see it happen, and we'd like to see what it can do, and they would too. But even if they got us, modest advance, I'm not going to break their kneecaps over it if they're a year later or 6 months late, because who knows what happened in their family? Maybe their mom got sick. Maybe they were saddled suddenly by their department with 2 extra courses, and they didn't expect to be teaching. It is a dirty little secret. There's not a lot of money in it. If that was what's driving you, you should probably go sell cars or something.
Well, I always tell people, if you want to make money in publishing, do self-published fantasy fiction. That's where all the money is. So I actually know people who are making a modest living off of that.
Good for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know it can be done if you break through to some degree there as well, if you get enough followers. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Well, Michael Thomson, thank you for sharing your wisdom and all of your experience in publishing with us.
Well, I appreciate the time. I hope there was 1 or 2 worthwhile nuggets in the conversation. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.